Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Crazy Horse, one of the most enigmatic and powerful figures in Native American history. His name echoes through time as a symbol of resistance, courage, and the indomitable spirit of the Lakota people. Born into a world of vast prairies and ancient traditions, he would become a warrior whose legend transcended his own lifetime. A man who fought not for glory or recognition, but for the preservation of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. As we journey through his story tonight, we will explore the landscape of his youth, the battles that defined him, the visions that guided him, and the legacy that continues to inspire people around the world. Let us settle in, breathe deeply, and travel back to the mid-19th century, to the Great Plains of North America, where the wind whispered through the tall grasses and the thunder of buffalo hooves shook the earth. To understand Crazy Horse, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The year was approximately 1840, though the exact date remains uncertain, shrouded in the mists of oral tradition and a culture that did not mark time as European settlers did. He was born somewhere along the banks of Rapid Creek, in the shadow of the Black Hills, a place the Lakota called Paha Sapa, the heart of everything that is. These mountains were sacred, rising dark and mysterious from the surrounding plains, their pine-covered slopes harboring spirits and dreams, their caves and peaks holding the prayers of generations. The Lakota people, part of the Great Sioux Nation, had themselves only recently arrived in this territory. Just a century before Crazy Horse's birth, they had lived further east, in the forests and lake country of what is now Minnesota. But pressure from other tribes, armed with guns obtained from European traders, had pushed them westward onto the Great Plains. There, they underwent a remarkable transformation. They acquired horses, descendants of those brought by Spanish conquistadors centuries earlier, and these magnificent animals changed everything. The Lakota became masters of the horse, developing a culture of mobility and martial prowess that would make them one of the most formidable peoples on the plains. The world of Crazy Horse's childhood was one of incredible abundance. The Great Plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of grass that turned gold in the summer sun and silver in the winter frost. Vast herds of buffalo, numbering in the millions, migrated across these grasslands, their movements dictating the rhythm of Lakota life. The buffalo provided everything: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread and bowstrings. Nothing was wasted. The relationship between the Lakota and the buffalo was not merely practical, but deeply spiritual. The buffalo was brother, provider, teacher. Into this world, Crazy Horse was born. His birth name was not Crazy Horse, but rather Cha-O-Ha, meaning in the wilderness, or among the trees. His father was also called Crazy Horse, a respected holy man of the Oglala Lakota, and his mother was Rattling Blanket Woman, sister of Spotted Tail, who would later become a famous chief. The family belonged to the Oglala Band, one of the 7 council fires of the Lakota Nation, and within the Oglala, they were members of the Hunkpatila, a small band known for staying close to their relatives. From his earliest days, young Cha-O-Ha was different. His appearance set him apart from other Lakota children. While most had dark eyes and black hair, his hair was light brown with a reddish tint, and his skin was noticeably lighter than his peers. Some accounts suggest his eyes were hazel or even light-colored. These unusual features would later contribute to his mystique, but in childhood, they sometimes made him the subject of teasing and speculation. Some whispered that his grandmother had been a Cheyenne woman, captured in earlier raids, and that this accounted for his different appearance. Others simply accepted him as touched by the spirits in some unique way. His personality, even in youth, was marked by quietness and introspection. While other boys boasted and competed loudly, Chao-Ha observed and absorbed. He spent long hours alone, watching the clouds move across the sky, studying the habits of animals, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him. His father, the holy man, recognized in his son a spirit that walked between worlds, and he nurtured this contemplative nature, while also ensuring the boy learned the skills necessary for survival on the plains. The education of a warrior. The education of a Lakota boy was comprehensive and began early. From the moment he could walk, Chao-Ha was learning the skills that would one day make him a warrior. But this learning was not harsh or regimented in the European sense. Instead, it was woven into the fabric of daily life, passed down through stories, games, and gentle guidance from elders. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly. Lakota children were placed on horses as toddlers, their small bodies naturally finding balance and rhythm with the animal's movements. By the age of 5 or 6, Chao-Ha could ride at full gallop, his small hands gripping the mane, his legs pressed tight against the horse's flanks. He learned to control the horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, to become one with the animal, to think and move as the horse thought and moved. This was not merely a practical skill, but a spiritual connection. For the Lakota believed that the horse had medicine, power that could be shared with a worthy rider. He learned to hunt with increasing sophistication. First came small game, rabbits and prairie birds, pursued with a child's bow and blunt arrows. His father and uncles taught him patience, how to move silently through the grass, how to read the wind and understand the habits of his prey. They taught him respect, the necessity of thanking the animal's spirit for its sacrifice, of taking only what was needed. As he grew older and stronger, his weapons grew more serious. He learned to make arrows that flew straight and true, to knap flint and obsidian into sharp points, to judge distance and compensate for wind. Wrestling was another crucial part of his education. Lakota boys spent countless hours grappling with each other, building strength and learning to use leverage and technique rather than mere force. These contests built bonds between the boys, created friendships and rivalries that would last lifetimes. Chao-Ha, despite his quiet nature, proved himself formidable in these contests. His wiry frame concealed surprising strength, and his habit of close observation served him well. He could read his opponent's intentions in subtle shifts of weight and balance, could anticipate moves before they happened. But physical skills were only part of a warrior's education. Equally important were the qualities of character that the Lakota valued above all else. Bravery, certainly, but not recklessness. Generosity, the willingness to give away possessions to those in need. Wisdom, the ability to make decisions that benefited the people as a whole. Fortitude, the strength to endure hardship without complaint. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to control oneself, to master one's own emotions and desires. The stories told around the evening fires reinforced these values. The elders recounted tales of ancient heroes, of clever Iktomi the spider trickster, of the white buffalo calf woman who brought the sacred pipe to the people, of great warriors who had sacrificed themselves for their bands. Young Chao-Ha absorbed these stories, storing them away in his memory, using them as guides for his own behavior. He also learned the spiritual practices of his people. His father, as a holy man, was his primary teacher in these matters. He learned about Wakantanka, the great mystery, the spiritual force that animated all things. He learned that everything possessed spirit, the stones, the trees, the animals, the very air itself. He learned to pray, to offer tobacco, to conduct himself with reverence in sacred places. He learned about the vision quest, the crucial rite of passage in which a young man would go alone to a remote place, fast, and pray for days, seeking a vision that would guide his life path and reveal his guardian spirit. The vision that changed everything. When Chao Ha was still a young teenager, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, an event occurred that would profoundly affect his father, and through him, the boy himself. A Lakota warrior named Conquering Bear, who had been designated as head chief of all the Lakota by American officials, was killed in an incident that came to be known as the Grattan Massacre. The circumstances were these. A Mormon emigrant's cow had wandered into a Lakota camp. A visiting Miniconjou warrior had killed and eaten the cow, as was customary when an animal entered one's camp. The Mormon demanded compensation, and American soldiers, led by the young and inexperienced Lieutenant John Grattan, marched into the Lakota camp to arrest the man who had killed the cow. The situation escalated rapidly. Shots were fired. Conquering Bear was mortally wounded. The Lakota warriors then killed Grattan and all of his men in retaliation. This incident marked a turning point. The relatively peaceful coexistence between the Lakota and the increasing number of emigrants passing through their territory was ending. The American government would respond to the Grattan incident with increased military presence and punitive expeditions. The old ways were under threat, and everyone could sense it. For young Chao Ha, watching the adults grapple with these changes, understanding was beginning to dawn about the nature of the conflict facing his people. The white men were not merely passing through on their way to somewhere else. They were coming to stay, to take the land, to change everything. It was in this context of growing tension that Chao Ha undertook his vision quest. The exact timing is uncertain, but it was likely around his 14th or 15th year. Guided by his father, he prepared himself through purification in the sweat lodge, fasting to cleanse his body and open his spirit. Then he went alone to a remote place, likely somewhere in the Black Hills, taking nothing with him but a buffalo robe and his prayers. For days he remained there, without food or water, praying and waiting. The summer sun beat down on him during the day, and the cool mountain air chilled him at night. His body weakened. His mind began to float free of its normal boundaries. He entered that liminal state between waking and sleeping, between the physical and spiritual worlds. And then the vision came. He saw himself riding a horse through a storm. Thunder rumbled around him, lightning flashed, rain poured down, but none of it touched him. His horse seemed to float above the ground, moving through the chaos untouched. He wore no war paint, no traditional regalia. His face was unpainted, his hair unbraided and loose. He wore only a simple breechcloth and a single hawk's feather in his hair. Behind his ear was a small brown stone. The horse had patterns painted on it, and a lightning bolt was streaked down its face. People from his own band reached out to grab him, to hold him back, but he rode through their grasping hands. Bullets and arrows flew around him, but did not strike him. The storm raged, but could not harm him. He was untouchable, riding between worlds, protected by powers beyond the physical. Then the vision shifted. He saw himself after the battle, covered in dust. His own people were holding him back, trying to restrain him, and it was they who threatened him, not his enemies. This part of the vision troubled him even as he tried to understand it. When he returned from his vision quest, weak and transformed, he told his father what he had seen. The holy man Crazy Horse listened carefully and then helped his son interpret the vision's meaning. The storm represented the chaos of battle. The horse floating above the ground represented the spiritual protection that would keep him safe. The simplicity of his dress was important. He should never take spoils from the battlefield, never burden himself with material things taken from enemies. The hawk's feather was his sacred symbol. The stone behind his ear would be his protective medicine. But most importantly, the vision taught that he would be protected in battle as long as he never took anything for himself, never sought personal glory or gain. He was to be a warrior for his people, not for his own advancement. And the troubling part about his own people holding him back was a warning. He must never put himself above the people, must never let pride separate him from those he served. This vision would guide Crazy Horse for the rest of his life. It was not merely a dream or a hopeful prophecy. In Lakota belief, it was a glimpse of his true nature, his role in the great pattern of existence. It showed him who he was meant to be. Shortly after this vision quest, his father performed a ceremony and gave his own name, Crazy Horse, to his son. The father took a new name, Worm. From that moment on, the young man was no longer Chaoha, or the boy called Curly by some of his friends because of his light, wavy hair. He was Crazy Horse, and he would live out the vision he had been given. The young warrior emerges. The late 1850s saw Crazy Horse emerging as a warrior of note among the Oglala. These were turbulent years on the plains. The emigrant trails were becoming highways, with thousands of settlers streaming west toward Oregon and California, and later toward the gold fields of Colorado. Each wagon train consumed resources: grass for the animals, game for the hunters. The buffalo herds were beginning to feel the pressure, their migration patterns disrupted. American military posts were being established throughout Lakota territory. The government was determined to protect the emigrants and to assert control over the native peoples. Treaties were negotiated, boundaries drawn on maps in Washington, agreements made with chiefs who often did not have the authority to speak for all their people. The Lakota way was not autocratic. Chiefs led by example and persuasion, not by command. If a warrior chose not to follow a chief's decision, he was free to go his own way, to join another band, or to strike out independently. Crazy Horse participated in his first raids during this period. These were not the massive battles that would come later, but smaller-scale conflicts. Raids against traditional enemies like the Crow, Shoshone, and Pawnee, skirmishes with emigrant trains, encounters with soldiers. These engagements were how young warriors proved themselves, how they earned the respect of their elders and peers. In Lakota culture, warfare was deeply ritualized and carried multiple purposes. Yes, there was the practical aspect of protecting territory and resources, but equally important were the spiritual and social dimensions. A warrior gained honor through acts of bravery, particularly the practice of counting coup, which meant touching an enemy in battle and living to tell about it. Killing an enemy was less prestigious than counting coup on him, as the latter required getting dangerously close while demonstrating the courage to spare the enemy's life. Warriors also gained status by stealing horses from enemy camps, a practice that required stealth, planning, and nerve. Crazy Horse excelled in all these aspects of warfare. His habit of careful observation served him well. He studied the terrain, the habits of his enemies, the patterns of their movements. He planned his actions carefully, but executed them with startling speed and decisiveness. Other warriors began to notice that when Crazy Horse was in a fight, things went well. He seemed to know instinctively where to strike, when to press an advantage, when to withdraw. His vision quest had promised him protection, and it seemed to be true. Bullets and arrows seemed to pass around him without striking. But it was not merely supernatural protection that kept him safe. Crazy Horse was exceptionally skilled. He rode better than almost anyone, could shoot accurately at full gallop, could wield a war club or lance with deadly precision. His reflexes were lightning quick. He could read a battle unfolding around him and position himself accordingly. And crucially, he never panicked. In the chaos and terror of combat, when other men's minds might freeze or race uncontrollably, Crazy Horse remained calm and focused. His appearance in battle was distinctive. Following his vision, he wore minimal decoration. While other warriors might paint themselves elaborately, wear feathered headdresses, carry decorated shields, Crazy Horse kept himself simple. A single hawk feather in his hair, the small stone behind his ear, sometimes white spots painted on his body and lightning streaks on his horse. This simplicity made him instantly recognizable and added to his mystique. Stories about him began to circulate. There was the time he rode directly through a Crow camp at dawn, counting coup on several warriors before they could react, escaping untouched despite the arrows that pursued him. There was the raid, where he stole 50 horses from a Shoshone herd, driving them across impossible terrain to safety. There was the skirmish with soldiers where he rode between the two lines of fire, drawing the shooting away from his companions, bullets kicking up dust all around his horse, but never finding their mark. His fellow warriors began to see him as carrying powerful medicine. They wanted to fight alongside him because his presence seemed to bring protection and success. Young boys listened with wide eyes to stories about him, dreaming of the day they might ride with Crazy Horse. And yet, despite this growing reputation, Crazy Horse himself remained quiet and humble. He did not boast. He did not seek attention. When a fight was over, he would slip away to be alone or return to camp and say little about what had happened. Others would tell the stories. He seemed almost indifferent to the fame that was accumulating around his name. The woman he could not have. In the midst of his emerging career as a warrior, Crazy Horse experienced a profound personal heartbreak that would affect him for years. Her name was Black Buffalo Woman, and she was perhaps the most beautiful girl in the Oglala bands. She was also the niece of Red Cloud, an increasingly important war leader and political figure among the Oglala. Crazy Horse and Black Buffalo Woman had known each other since childhood. As they grew older, a deep affection developed between them. They would find opportunities to meet and talk away from the eyes of the camp. In Lakota culture, courtship had its own rituals and proprieties. A young man would play his flute outside a girl's lodge at night, hoping she would come out to talk with him, wrapped in her blanket. Couples would stand together wrapped in a single courting blanket, talking quietly while others could see them but not hear their words. Crazy Horse courted Black Buffalo Woman in this way. By all accounts, she returned his feelings. They spoke of marriage, of a life together. He gave her gifts, as was customary. He performed deeds of bravery and brought her the honors, dedicating his accomplishments to her. But there was a problem. Black Buffalo Woman's family, particularly Red Cloud, had other plans for her. They wanted her to marry a man named No Water. This marriage would cement political alliances between families and bands. No Water was older than Crazy Horse, already established as a warrior and hunter, and came from a good family. He was a solid, practical choice. The exact details of what happened next are unclear. lost in conflicting accounts and the passage of time. What is certain is that Black Buffalo Woman married no water, despite her feelings for Crazy Horse. Whether she was pressured into this marriage by her family, whether she made a pragmatic choice for security, whether Crazy Horse's poverty and lack of family influence made him an unsuitable match in Red Cloud's eyes, all of this remains uncertain. What is clear is that Crazy Horse was devastated. For a man who kept his emotions carefully controlled, who showed little outward feeling even in the midst of battle, this rejection cut deep. Some accounts suggest he went into a period of mourning, disappearing into the wilderness for days at a time. Others say he threw himself even more intensely into warfare, taking greater risks, seeking death or glory with equal indifference. The loss of Black Buffalo Woman seemed to confirm for Crazy Horse a path he was perhaps already inclined toward. He would not marry, would not establish a family, would not seek personal happiness or domestic comfort. He would be a warrior for his people, and that would be enough. His life would be his vision, nothing more, nothing less. This would not be the end of the story of Crazy Horse and Black Buffalo Woman. Their paths would cross again years later, with even more dramatic consequences. But for now, in his young manhood, Crazy Horse set aside personal desires and devoted himself entirely to the growing struggle facing his people. The Gathering Storm. By the early 1860s, the situation on the Great Plains had become increasingly tense. The American Civil War was consuming the nation's attention in the East. But on the frontier, the steady pressure of American expansion continued. Gold had been discovered in Colorado and Montana, and miners were flooding into territories that had been guaranteed to the Lakota by treaty. The Bozeman Trail, which cut through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds to reach the Montana goldfields, became a particular point of contention. The U.S. Army established forts along the Bozeman Trail, ostensibly to protect emigrants, but effectively claiming control over Lakota territory. Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Rhino, and Fort C.F. Smith became symbols of American encroachment. For many Lakota, these forts were intolerable intrusions, violations of the treaties that had been signed just years before. Red Cloud, the Oglala war leader, emerged as the primary organizer of resistance to these forts. Red Cloud was a formidable figure, a brilliant tactician and diplomat who could unite the often fractious Lakota bands into coordinated action. He was also the uncle of Black Buffalo Woman, the woman Crazy Horse had loved and lost, which created a complicated relationship between the two men. Despite any personal tensions, Crazy Horse recognized that Red Cloud's war against the forts was necessary and just. The white soldiers were not merely passing through. They were claiming the land, killing the buffalo, bringing diseases, and threatening the entire Lakota way of life. If the forts were allowed to stand, more would follow. The end would be inevitable. Crazy Horse became one of Red Cloud's most effective warriors during what would come to be called Red Cloud's War. He participated in countless raids and skirmishes, harassing soldiers who ventured outside the forts, attacking wagon trains, keeping the Americans under constant pressure. The Lakota tactics during this period were brilliantly suited to their strengths: mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to strike quickly and disappear. The soldiers, by contrast, were often ill-suited to plains warfare. They came from Eastern backgrounds, trained in conventional military tactics that assumed armies would face each other in organized formations. The Lakota way of fighting seemed chaotic to them, without clear front lines or set-piece battles. They found it difficult to adapt, and their heavy cavalry could not keep pace with the swift Lakota ponies. During this period, Crazy Horse refined the tactical approach that would become his signature. He understood the importance of terrain, of using hills and valleys to conceal movements until the last moment. He understood how to draw enemies into traps, how to use decoys to lure soldiers into disadvantageous positions. He understood the psychology of combat, how to create confusion and fear in his opponents, how to make a smaller force seem larger through coordination and timing. He also developed a reputation for personal bravery that bordered on the reckless. He would often position himself in the most dangerous spot in a battle, would expose himself to draw enemy fire away from his companions, would make bold charges that seemed suicidal but somehow always succeeded. His fellow warriors came to believe that he truly was protected by supernatural powers, that the spirits had granted him invulnerability. But Crazy Horse knew better. He knew that his protection came from skill, preparation, and an almost superhuman level of situational awareness. He seemed to process information about the battlefield at a speed others could not match, to see openings and opportunities that others missed. And he had long ago made peace with the possibility of death. If he died in battle defending his people, he would die well. This acceptance freed him from the fear that might paralyze others. The Fetterman Fight. The climax of Red Cloud's War came on December 21, 1866, in an event that the Lakota would remember as a great victory and the Americans would call the Fetterman Massacre. Crazy Horse played a central role in this battle, which would become one of the most stunning defeats ever inflicted on the U.S. Army by Native forces. The plan was carefully coordinated among the Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. Fort Phil Kearny was the target, or more specifically, the soldiers who ventured outside its walls. The Native forces had observed the fort's routines, had noted the predictable ways the soldiers responded to threats. They knew that when woodcutting parties were attacked, soldiers would be sent out to rescue them. The plan was to use decoys to lure a detachment of soldiers away from the fort, over a ridge called Lodge Trail Ridge, and into a carefully prepared ambush. Crazy Horse was chosen to lead the decoy party, a role that required the perfect balance of courage and restraint. He had to get close enough to the soldiers to draw them out, but not so close that they could catch the decoys before reaching the ambush site. He had to maintain the illusion of vulnerability while actually controlling the entire movement of the trap. On that cold December morning, the plan was set in motion. A woodcutting party was attacked, and as expected, soldiers rode out from the fort. Captain William Fetterman led a column of about 80 soldiers and civilians, armed with new rifles and confident in their military superiority. They had orders not to pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, but the lure of the fleeing decoys proved irresistible. Crazy Horse and his small group of warriors appeared before the soldiers, seemingly within easy reach. They rode back and forth, taunting the soldiers, occasionally turning as if to fight, and then fleeing again. Fetterman and his men followed, convinced they were about to massacre a small party of warriors. The decoys led them up and over Lodge Trail Ridge, into the valley beyond. As soon as the entire column had crossed the ridge, the trap was sprung. Suddenly, from all sides, hundreds of warriors appeared. The soldiers found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from the fort, caught in a killing ground. The battle was over in less than an hour. Fetterman and all 80 of his men were killed. Not one survived. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, this was an overwhelming victory. They had fought bravely and skillfully, had executed a complex plan perfectly, had defeated a superior force armed with the white man's weapons. Crazy Horse had proven himself not just as a warrior, but as a tactician and leader. His role in the victory enhanced his reputation enormously. But the victory would prove to be complicated in its consequences. The American public was outraged by what they saw as a massacre of their soldiers. The military establishment was humiliated and determined to restore its reputation. The Peace Party in Washington, which had been advocating for negotiation rather than military conquest, lost influence. More troops would be sent west. More resources would be devoted to subjugating the Plains tribes. In the immediate aftermath, however, the Fetterman fight achieved Red Cloud's goals. The harassment of the forts continued through the following year. The Americans found it impossible to maintain supply lines or protect travelers on the Bozeman Trail. Finally, in 1868, the government agreed to negotiate. The resulting Fort Laramie Treaty closed the forts, abandoned the Bozeman Trail, and recognized a Great Sioux Reservation that included all of present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River, including the Black Hills. Red Cloud signed the treaty and retired from warfare, believing he had won his war and secured his people's lands. But Crazy Horse did not sign. He did not trust the white man's words written on paper. He had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises forgotten. He knew that the Americans were not withdrawing out of respect for Lakota rights, but out of temporary necessity. They would be back. The struggle was not over. The life between wars. The period following the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was a time of relative peace on the northern plains, but it was a tense peace, fragile and uncertain. The Lakota were divided in their responses to the changing situation. Some, like Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, chose to accept the reservation system, believing it was the only way to ensure their people's survival. They moved to agencies where they received government rations and tried to adapt to a new way of life. Others, including Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa, refused to come into the agencies. They remained in the unceded territories, continuing to follow the buffalo, continuing to live as their ancestors had lived. These bands became known to the Americans as hostiles or non-treaty Indians, though they called themselves simply free people. Crazy Horse spent these years ranging across what is now Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. He hunted buffalo, raided traditional enemies, and lived according to the old ways. The landscape he moved through was still magnificent, though signs of change were everywhere. The buffalo herds were noticeably smaller. The old migration routes were being disrupted, and always there were more white men, more miners, more ranchers, more soldiers. It was during this period, around 1870 or 1871, that Crazy Horse finally took a wife. Her name was Black Shawl, a quiet, gentle woman who seemed to understand and accept his nature. Unlike the passionate, complicated feelings he had harbored for Black Buffalo Woman, his relationship with Black Shawl was characterized by calm companionship. She did not ask him to be something he was not. She managed his lodge, prepared his food, made his clothing, and asked little in return. They had a daughter, whom they named They Are Afraid of Her. The arrival of this child softened something in Crazy Horse. Those who knew him remarked that he would sit for hours playing with the little girl, smiling at her antics, a tenderness in his face that few had ever seen. For a brief time, it seemed that Crazy Horse might find some measure of domestic happiness, some respite from the constant warfare and wandering. But tragedy would strike this small family. When They Are Afraid of Her was perhaps 3 years old, she fell ill. Some accounts say it was cholera, others tuberculosis or whooping cough. The diseases brought by white contact were devastating to native peoples who had no immunity. Medicine men tried their healing ceremonies, but nothing could save her. Crazy Horse watched helplessly as his daughter weakened and died. The death of his daughter devastated Crazy Horse. He went into deep mourning, disappearing for days at a time, refusing comfort. Black Shawl, too, was stricken with grief, and also with the disease that had killed their daughter. She would survive but would never fully recover her health. The tubercular condition that afflicted her would dog her for the rest of her life. After this loss, something changed in Crazy Horse. The brief softening that fatherhood had brought vanished. He became even more withdrawn, even more focused on his role as a warrior and protector. Some who knew him said that after his daughter's death, he seemed to be waiting for his own death, perhaps even seeking it in battle, though his medicine kept him safe despite his recklessness. The old loves return. In the summer of 1870, the complicated story of Crazy Horse and Black Buffalo Woman took another dramatic turn. Black Buffalo Woman's marriage to No Water had not been happy. By all accounts, No Water was a jealous, violent man. He drank the white man's whiskey and became abusive. Black Buffalo Woman was unhappy, trapped in a marriage that brought her no joy. When the bands came together that summer for the Sun Dance, the most sacred ceremony of the Lakota people, Black Buffalo Woman and Crazy Horse encountered each other again. The old feelings, which had never truly died, reignited. They began to meet secretly, to talk as they had years before. The attraction between them was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having been denied so long. What happened next violated Lakota custom and created a scandal that would have far-reaching consequences. Black Buffalo Woman and Crazy Horse decided to run away together. In Lakota society, there were proper ways to end a marriage and begin a new one. A woman could divorce her husband by simply placing his belongings outside the lodge. But to run away with another man while still married, particularly without attempting any reconciliation or payment to the husband, was considered deeply wrong. They fled together, leaving No Water humiliated and enraged. For several weeks, they were gone, perhaps hoping that time and distance would allow the situation to calm, that eventually No Water would accept the situation, or that they could arrange some settlement. But No Water was not prepared to accept the loss of his wife. He armed himself with a pistol and set out to find them. When No Water caught up with them, they were in the camp of Little Big Man, another Oglala warrior who was Crazy Horse's friend. Black Buffalo Woman was inside the lodge when No Water burst in, gun drawn. Crazy Horse, hearing the commotion, came to the lodge entrance. No Water fired. The bullet struck Crazy Horse in the face, shattering his jaw and teeth. For a moment, it seemed Crazy Horse might die. He fell, blood pouring from his face, but his medicine was strong, and the wound, though terrible, was not quite fatal. He survived, though he would carry the scar for the rest of his life, and would sometimes experience pain from the injury. No Water fled immediately after the shooting, fearing retaliation. But the situation was complicated. By the rules of Lakota society, No Water had been wronged by Crazy Horse's actions. The shooting could be seen as justified. On the other hand, Crazy Horse was a respected warrior, and violence within the band was generally discouraged. The whole affair threatened to split the Oglala. The chiefs and elders intervened to prevent blood feud. A settlement was arranged. Crazy Horse gave No Water horses as compensation for the injury to his honor. Black Buffalo Woman returned to No Water, though she was pregnant with Crazy Horse's child. That child would be born the following spring, a daughter who would be a constant reminder of what had happened. The affair damaged Crazy Horse's reputation and standing in the band. He had acted without regard for custom and had nearly caused serious division among the people. For a man who had devoted himself to serving his people, this was a bitter realization. He withdrew even further, spending more time alone or with small hunting parties, avoiding the larger gatherings where the shame of his actions seemed to follow him. The last free years, while Crazy Horse dealt with personal turmoil, the larger situation facing the Lakota was deteriorating. The Fort Laramie Treaty, which had seemed to promise peace and recognition of Lakota sovereignty, was already being violated. The issue was gold. In 1874, an American military expedition, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, entered the Black Hills and confirmed rumors of gold deposits there. The Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota, the heart of their territory, explicitly protected by the 1868 treaty. But once gold was confirmed, nothing could stop the flood of miners. The American government made a half-hearted attempt to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota. Commissioners were sent to negotiate with Red Cloud and other chiefs at the agencies. But the price the Americans offered was insultingly low, and many Lakota had no interest in selling at any price. The negotiations failed. The government then took a different approach. In December 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued an ultimatum. All Lakota must report to the agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. For the non-treaty bands led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, this was an impossible demand. They were in their winter camps, scattered across the northern plains. The weather was brutally cold. Moving entire villages with women, children, and elders through the deep snow to agencies hundreds of miles away was not feasible. But feasibility was not the point. The order was designed to be impossible to comply with. It gave the military a pretext to launch campaigns against the hostiles without the government appearing to break the treaty. If the Lakota wouldn't come to the agencies voluntarily, they would be forced there by military action. In the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army launched a three-pronged campaign to round up the non-treaty bands. General George Crook would move north from Wyoming. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Montana. General Alfred Terry, with Custer's 7th Cavalry under his command, would move west from Dakota. The plan was to catch the Lakota between these converging columns and force them to surrender or be destroyed. But the Lakota and Cheyenne were preparing as well. Throughout the winter and spring of 1876, the various bands began to come together. Not just the non-treaty bands led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, but also many people from the agencies who slipped away to join their free relatives for the summer buffalo hunt. The camp that was forming along the rivers of Montana was growing larger than any gathering in years, perhaps the largest in Lakota history. Sitting Bull, the great spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa, called for a sun dance to unite the people and seek guidance from the spirits. Crazy Horse and thousands of others participated in or witnessed this ceremony. Sitting Bull himself performed the sacred ritual, dancing and fasting for days, making offerings of his flesh. At the climax of his ordeal, he received a vision, soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers falling from the sky. It was a prophecy of victory, a promise that the people would triumph over their enemies. With this spiritual assurance, the bands moved through the Montana landscape, following the buffalo, celebrating their freedom. They knew soldiers were coming, but felt strong in their numbers and in the rightness of their cause. They were in their own territory, guaranteed to them by treaty. They were simply living as they had always lived. If the soldiers wanted war, the people would give them war. The Battle of the Rosebud. On June 17, 1876, General Crook's column, consisting of over 1,300 soldiers and allied Crow and Shoshone scouts, was moving north toward the Lakota camps. But Crazy Horse and the Lakota knew they were coming. Scouts had been tracking the soldiers for days. Crazy Horse and other war leaders decided on a bold strategy. Rather than wait for the soldiers to attack the village, they would attack the soldiers in the field. It was unusual for native forces to seek out a pitched battle with such a large military force, but the people were confident in their numbers and in their warriors' abilities. On the morning of June 17th, Crazy Horse led a force of hundreds of warriors, Lakota and Cheyenne, against Crook's column near the Rosebud Creek. The battle that followed lasted for hours, one of the longest sustained engagements between the U.S. Army and Plains Indians. It was not the hit-and-run tactics that characterized many native conflicts with the military. This was a determined assault, wave after wave, with the warriors pressing their advantages with unusual aggression. Crazy Horse was everywhere in the battle, rallying his warriors, leading charges, exploiting weaknesses in the soldiers' lines. His tactical brilliance was on full display. He understood how to coordinate attacks across a wide front, how to keep pressure on multiple points simultaneously, how to prevent the soldiers from concentrating their forces effectively. The Crow and Shoshone scouts fighting with Crook fought bravely as well, protecting the soldiers from being overrun. The battle swayed back and forth across the broken terrain near the creek. Soldiers would establish positions, only to be driven back by determined charges. Warriors would press an advantage, only to be forced to withdraw under heavy rifle fire. By afternoon, both sides were exhausted. Crook's force had suffered significant casualties and was clearly unable to continue its advance. The warriors, sensing that they had achieved their objective, began to withdraw. Crook declared the Battle of the Rosebud a victory, but his actions told a different story. Rather than continuing north toward the Lakota camps, he retreated south to establish a base camp and wait for reinforcements. He had been stopped. His campaign effectively ended before it could accomplish its goals. For Crazy Horse and the Lakota, the Rosebud was indeed a victory. They had met a large military force in open battle and forced it to retreat. Warriors had proven their courage and skill. The prophecies of victory seemed to be coming true. But there was little time to celebrate. Even as they returned to the village to tell of their success, another column of soldiers was approaching from a different direction. Greasy Grass. 8 days after the Battle of the Rosebud, on June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry approached the Lakota village on the Little Bighorn River, which the Lakota called the Greasy Grass. Custer was a controversial figure, a Civil War hero known for his aggressive tactics and his contempt for native opponents. He had been part of the 1874 expedition that confirmed gold in the Black Hills, and now he was determined to strike a decisive blow against the hostiles. Custer had been offered Gatling guns and additional troops, but had refused them, apparently confident that his cavalry alone could defeat whatever force they encountered. He had not waited for the other columns to get into position, apparently hoping to claim sole credit for a victory. Now, as his scouts brought him reports of the massive village ahead, he faced a decision. The village was enormous, stretching for miles along the river. Conservative estimates suggest there were at least 7,000 people present, including perhaps 2,800 to 2,000 warriors. But Custer's scouts were telling him that the village was much larger than he had anticipated. His Crow scouts were urging him to wait, to call for reinforcements. But Custer feared that if he waited, the village would scatter. He decided to attack. Custer divided his force, a tactical decision that has been debated ever since. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen with 3 companies to scout to the south. He sent Major Marcus Reno with 3 companies to attack the southern end of the village. He himself, with 5 companies, rode north along the ridges above the village, apparently intending to strike at a different point. Reno's attack on the southern end of the village around 3 p.m. began the battle. His soldiers charged across the river but were quickly met by a swarm of warriors. Among those who responded immediately was Crazy Horse. He had been resting in his lodge when the alarm was raised. Within minutes, he had mounted his horse and was riding toward the sound of gunfire. Reno's charge was quickly stopped and then thrown back. The soldiers dismounted and formed a skirmish line, but the volume of fire from the warriors was too intense. Warriors were shooting from cover, from the riverbank, from the cottonwood trees. Soldiers began to fall. Reno ordered a retreat to the timber by the river, then a desperate scramble up the bluffs to more defensible ground. Men died in this retreat, including the scout Bloody Knife, whose brain matter splattered across Reno's face. By the time Reno's battered force reached the top of the bluffs, they had suffered significant casualties and were in no condition to continue the fight. Meanwhile, Custer and his 5 companies were moving along the ridge system north of the village. Exactly what happened over the next hour or two has been the subject of endless speculation, as no one from Custer's immediate command survived to tell the tale. What is known is that Custer attempted to attack the village from the north, but was met by overwhelming force. Crazy Horse played a central role in the destruction of Custer's command. Various accounts from Lakota and Cheyenne warriors describe how he led a large force across the river and up onto the ridges where Custer's men were positioned. While other warriors kept up heavy fire from long range, Crazy Horse led a mounted charge directly into the soldiers' position. This was warfare as the Lakota practiced it at its highest level. Warriors on horseback, moving at tremendous speed, using the terrain, working together with practiced coordination. Crazy Horse was at the front, calling out to his followers, his presence inspiring them to feats of reckless courage. His medicine was strong. Bullets passed around him. He seemed invincible. The soldiers, many of them recent recruits unfamiliar with their weapons and with plains warfare, were overwhelmed. Their discipline broke under the combined pressure of long-range fire and close-quarter charges. Companies became separated, lost cohesion. Individual soldiers and small groups tried to make stands, but they were isolated and quickly overrun. The whole engagement was over in perhaps an hour or two from when Custer's command came under serious attack. Over 260 soldiers and attached personnel died, including Custer himself and every man under his immediate command. It was the worst defeat the U.S. Army would suffer in the Indian Wars. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, it was an overwhelming victory, greater even than the Fetterman fight. They had defeated a famous soldier chief, had wiped out an entire cavalry command, had proven that they could stand against the white man's soldiers and win. The warriors celebrated, held scalp dances, mourned their own dead, though casualties among the Lakota and Cheyenne were relatively light, perhaps 60 to 100 warriors killed, and felt vindicated in their choice to remain free. Crazy Horse, characteristically, did not join in the celebrations. He had done what he always did, fought for his people, protected the village, followed his vision. The battle was over. It was time to move on. But even in the moment of their greatest triumph, some of the older warriors and chiefs felt unease. This victory was too complete, too dramatic. The white men would never forget it. They would come back with more soldiers, more resources, more determination. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, which the whites would forever call Custer's Last Stand, would prove to be not the salvation of the Lakota way of life, but rather its death knell. The Long Retreat. The celebration after the Little Bighorn was brief. The Lakota and Cheyenne knew that more soldiers would be coming. The great village broke into smaller bands, scattering across the landscape to make themselves harder to find and to follow the buffalo herds that were their livelihood. They were right to be concerned. News of Custer's defeat shocked the American nation, coming as it did during the centennial celebrations of American independence. The public, which had been somewhat ambivalent about the Indian Wars, now clamored for vengeance. The military establishment, humiliated by the defeat, poured resources into the plains. The three-pronged campaign that had been disrupted became a five-pronged, then a seven-pronged operation. Thousands of soldiers, supported by supply trains and artillery, began crisscrossing the northern plains. General Crook, still smarting from his own defeat at the Rosebud, took to the field again with a large force. General Nelson Miles led his winter campaign, refusing to give the native bands any respite even in the brutal cold months when campaigning was traditionally suspended. General Ranald Mackenzie, who had made a name for himself fighting the Comanche and Cheyenne on the southern plains, brought his skills north. The strategy was not so much to seek out and destroy the native forces in pitched battle. The lessons of the Rosebud and Little Bighorn had been learned, but rather to pursue relentlessly, giving the bands no rest, burning their villages whenever found, destroying their food supplies, killing their horse herds. The idea was to make it impossible for the people to live in the old way, to slowly grind them down until they had no choice but to surrender. For Crazy Horse and those who followed him, this began a nightmarish period of constant movement and increasing hardship. They would establish a camp, only to have scouts bring word that soldiers were approaching. They would pack up and move, sometimes in the middle of the night, in blizzards, through deep snow. The old people and the children suffered terribly. Babies died of cold and exposure. The elderly, unable to keep up with the constant forced marches, were sometimes left behind with minimal supplies, essentially sentenced to death. The buffalo were scarce. The constant military pressure was disrupting what remained of the herds, and the hunters could not risk staying in one place long enough to properly hunt and prepare meat for the winter. People began to go hungry. Horses weakened and died, limiting mobility even further. Traditional enemies like the Crow and Shoshone, enlisted as scouts for the army, tracked the Lakota bands and reported their positions. In September 1876, Mackenzie destroyed a Cheyenne village, killing dozens and scattering the survivors. In October and November, Miles fought several engagements with Sitting Bull's band, forcing them to constantly move. In the brutal winter, soldiers kept up the pressure, attacking any camp they could find. Crazy Horse's band, perhaps 800 to 200 people, spent that winter of 1876-77 in the Powder River country. They moved constantly, desperately seeking game, trying to stay ahead of the soldiers. The conditions were some of the harshest ever recorded in that region, with temperatures dropping to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. People wrapped themselves in every hide and blanket they possessed and still froze. Frostbite was epidemic. Starvation was a constant threat. Crazy Horse did everything he could to keep his people alive. He led hunting parties in impossible conditions, riding for days to find game. He organized the defense of the camp whenever soldiers approached. He gave away his own rations to children and elders. He tried to maintain morale, to keep people from giving up hope. But even he could see that the situation was becoming untenable. By late winter, the choice facing Crazy Horse was stark. He could continue to lead his people in this desperate flight, watching them suffer and die with no realistic hope of improving their situation. Or he could surrender, take his people to the agency, and accept reservation life. It was a choice between physical death in the present and the death of a way of life. Emissaries from Red Cloud and Spotted Tail at the agencies were sent to Crazy Horse, urging him to come in. They promised that he and his people would be treated fairly, that they could keep their weapons and horses, that they would have their own agency in their own country. Some of these promises were sincere. Others were misleading, coming from Indian agents who were willing to say anything to secure Crazy Horse's surrender. Throughout the early months of 1877, Crazy Horse resisted. He still hoped that somehow a way forward could be found, that the people could retain their freedom. But reality was inexorable. His warriors were exhausted. The women and children were starving. The horses were dying. There was no food, no ammunition, no hope of military victory. Other bands were surrendering. Sitting Bull had taken his followers to Canada, beyond the reach of American soldiers, but that path was fraught with its own difficulties and would separate Crazy Horse from his homeland forever. Finally, in April of 1877, Crazy Horse sent word that he would come in. The great war leader, the man who had never signed a treaty, who had fought the whites for his entire adult life, who had defeated Crook and helped destroy Custer, was surrendering. The surrender on May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse led his band into Fort Robinson in northwestern Nebraska, near the Red Cloud Agency. The procession was one of the most extraordinary sights ever witnessed on the northern plains. Nearly 1,000 Oglala Lakota rode in formation, warriors in the lead, women and children following, horse herd in the rear. The warriors sang war songs, their voices carrying across the prairie. They rode slowly, with dignity, making it clear that this was not a defeated rabble slinking in to beg for mercy, but a people who still held their honor, making a choice to stop fighting. Crazy Horse rode at their head. He was perhaps 36 years old, but looked older, worn down by years of warfare and the harsh winter of constant flight. His face still bore the scar from the bullet no water had fired years before. He wore simple buckskin, his single hawk feather in his hair. He did not look defeated. He looked calm, resolute, perhaps resigned. The soldiers and officers at Fort Robinson watched the procession with mixed feelings. Some felt respect for the courage and skill of these warriors. Others felt triumph that the last major, hostile leader was finally surrendering. General Crook, who had pursued Crazy Horse for so long, was not present, but received word of the surrender with satisfaction. The terms of Crazy Horse's surrender were never entirely clear. He believed that he and his people would be allowed to return to their own country, somewhere in the Powder River region, and have their own agency there. He had been promised he could keep his weapons and horses. He had been told that he would be recognized as a chief of his people, free to live according to his own judgment, as long as he remained at peace. But the reality of reservation life quickly proved disillusioning. The agency system was designed to control and confine native peoples, to break down tribal structures and traditional ways of life. Indians were expected to become farmers, to adopt Christianity, to send their children to schools where they would be taught to abandon their culture. Rations were used as tools of control, dispensed or withheld based on cooperation with agency officials. Crazy Horse struggled with all of this. He was a man of action, used to making his own decisions, to moving freely across the landscape. Now he was confined to a small area, expected to wait in line for government handouts, to ask permission from white officials for basic activities. It grated against every fiber of his being. Moreover, he found himself caught in the politics and jealousies of reservation life. Red Cloud, the aging chief who had led the war against the Bozeman Trail forts years before, saw Crazy Horse as a rival for influence among the Oglala. Some of the mixed-blood interpreters and progressive Indians who worked with the agency saw Crazy Horse as a symbol of the old ways they were trying to leave behind. Army officers, aware of his reputation and perhaps somewhat in awe of him, watched him carefully for any sign of renewed resistance. Crazy Horse tried to adapt. He participated in some of the required activities, attended councils when asked, tried to provide for his people. But he could not change who he fundamentally was. He remained aloof from the social interactions that characterized agency life. He did not seek favor with the agents or try to position himself for the distribution of resources. He seemed to be simply enduring, waiting for something he could not quite name. His wife, Blackshaw, was ill, suffering from the tuberculosis that had afflicted her since their daughter's death years before. Crazy Horse devoted much of his energy to caring for her, seeking medicine men who might cure her. This personal preoccupation, combined with his natural reticence, meant that he was not building the political alliances and relationships that would have protected him in the complicated world of the agency. The final betrayal. In the summer of 1877, events moved quickly toward tragedy. The Nez Perce, a tribe from the Pacific Northwest, had gone to war against the United States, rather than accept confinement on a reservation. Under the leadership of Chief Joseph and others, they were fighting a brilliant running battle, trying to reach Canada and sanctuary. The Army wanted to use Lakota warriors, including Crazy Horse's followers, as scouts against the Nez Perce. When officers approached Crazy Horse about this, his response was either misunderstood or deliberately mistranslated by an interpreter who disliked him. Crazy Horse apparently said something to the effect that he had fought white soldiers often and would be happy to do so again, or possibly that he was willing to go north to fight, but would fight for his people rather than against fellow Indians. The interpreter, Frank Grouard, who had personal reasons to undermine Crazy Horse, told the officers that Crazy Horse had said he would fight until all the white men were killed. This was explosive. Officers who had been watching Crazy Horse with suspicion now became convinced he was planning an uprising. Other chiefs at the agency, jealous of his prestige or genuinely fearful of renewed warfare, added their voices to calls for his arrest. General Crook, communicating with the agency from his headquarters, ordered that Crazy Horse be taken into custody. Crazy Horse learned that he was to be arrested. On September 4, 1877, he and his wife Blackshaw left the agency, heading north toward the Spotted Tail Agency, about 40 miles away. Perhaps he hoped to find protection with Spotted Tail, his uncle by marriage. Perhaps he simply wanted to avoid arrest without fleeing into exile in Canada. Perhaps he was not thinking, clearly, worn down by months of confinement and worry about his wife's health. The next day, September 5th, officers and a contingent of Indian police, including some who had once ridden with Crazy Horse, set out to find him. They located him at Spotted Tail Agency. Spotted Tail urged Crazy Horse to return to Fort Robinson and clear up the misunderstanding. He promised that no harm would come to him. Crazy Horse, trusting his uncle's word or perhaps simply accepting the inevitable, agreed to return. When they arrived back at Fort Robinson that afternoon, Crazy Horse was led toward the post guardhouse. It was only when he reached the building and looked inside that he realized he was being taken to a cell, to imprisonment. For a man of his spirit, who had lived his entire life in freedom, The sight of those bars was intolerable. What happened next occurred very quickly and has been subject to varying accounts. Crazy Horse tried to resist, pulling a knife. His former friends and allies, the Indian police, grabbed him, tried to restrain him. A struggle ensued in the doorway of the guardhouse. Little Big Man, who had once fought alongside Crazy Horse, seized his arms from behind. A soldier, either bayoneting or stabbing, drove a blade into Crazy Horse's side, piercing his kidney. Crazy Horse fell. The wound was mortal, though death would not come immediately. He was carried to the adjutant's office and laid on the floor. His father, Old Worm, was summoned. Touch the Clouds, a 7-foot-tall Miniconjou chief who had befriended Crazy Horse, sat with him. Through the evening, as life slowly drained from him, Crazy Horse remained conscious, sometimes speaking quietly to those around him. He said his plans had been good. He said he wanted to be remembered. He said he had always been a friend to the white man. As the night wore on and his strength faded, he stopped speaking. Around midnight, in the early hours of September 6, 1877, Crazy Horse died. He was approximately 36 years old. The mystery of his burial after Crazy Horse's death, his father and mother claimed his body. They placed it on a burial platform according to traditional custom and then took it away. The exact location of Crazy Horse's burial place has never been revealed. Old Worm took his son's body somewhere into the vast landscape of the northern plains, placed it somewhere sacred and secret, and never told anyone exactly where. This final mystery has become part of Crazy Horse's legend. Treasure hunters and archaeologists have searched. Claims have been made over the years about the discovery of his grave, but none have been authenticated. The likelihood is that his burial place will never be found, that his body has long since returned to the earth in some forgotten canyon or hilltop, known only to the spirits and the stones. In a way, this seems fitting. Crazy Horse lived his life apart, never seeking recognition, never wanting to be captured or confined. Even in death, he remains free, unbound by monument or marker, present everywhere in the landscape he fought to defend, and nowhere in particular. Legacy and meaning. The death of Crazy Horse marked the end of an era. Within months of his death, the Great Sioux Reservation would be broken up. The Black Hills, guaranteed to the Lakota by treaty, would be taken. The buffalo herds would be destroyed, driven to near extinction by hide hunters supported by government policy. The free-roaming life of the Plains Indians would be ended, replaced by the confined existence of reservation life. Red Cloud would live for another 32 years, dying in 1909 at the approximate age of 88, adapting to reservation life and serving as a spokesperson for his people, though with diminishing influence. Sitting Bull would spend years in Canada before returning to surrender in 1881, would travel with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and would be killed by Indian police in 1890 during the Ghost Dance troubles. The world that Crazy Horse had known and fought for was gone, and yet Crazy Horse's memory did not fade. Instead, it grew. Among the Lakota, he was remembered as the ideal warrior, the man who never compromised, who fought for his people until the end. Stories about him multiplied, taking on legendary qualities. He became a symbol of resistance, of indigenous pride, of the refusal to submit to unjust power. As the 20th century progressed and Native American activism gained strength, Crazy Horse's name and image were increasingly invoked. He represented something pure, something uncorrupted by the compromises and defeats that had characterized Indian-white relations. The fact that he had never signed a treaty, never sold out his people, never adapted to reservation life, made him an icon of resistance. Perhaps his greatest memorial is the Crazy Horse Memorial in the Black Hills of South Dakota, begun in 1948 by sculptor Korczak Ziolkowski and still under construction today. The memorial, when completed, will depict Crazy Horse on horseback, pointing to the horizon, answering a question about where his lands are. "My lands are where my dead lie buried." Carved from a mountain, it will be the largest sculpture in the world, dwarfing Mount Rushmore. But Crazy Horse's real legacy is not in monuments of stone, but in the spirit of resistance and dignity that he represented. He stands as a reminder that there were those who refused to accept the destruction of their way of life, who fought against overwhelming odds, not for personal glory, but for a vision of how life should be lived. He represents the tragic nobility of a doomed cause embraced with complete commitment. Understanding the man. As we conclude this journey through the life of Crazy Horse, it is worth reflecting on who he really was, beyond the legend and the symbol. The historical record is fragmentary. Crazy Horse himself rarely spoke about his own life or motivations. He left no writings, no photographs. He refused to be photographed, believing that images captured the spirit. What we know comes from the recollections of people who knew him, from the accounts of his enemies, from fragments of oral tradition passed down through generations. What emerges is a portrait of a man of unusual intensity and focus. From his youth, Crazy Horse seemed to understand himself as a person with a specific purpose. His vision quest gave him a framework for understanding his role. He was to be a warrior in service of his people, protected by spiritual powers as long as he never took anything for himself, never sought personal gain or glory. He lived this vision with remarkable consistency. Even as a young man, when he might have been expected to boast and seek recognition, he remained humble and quiet. He gave away horses and other property rather than accumulating wealth. He avoided the political maneuvering and status-seeking that characterized many warriors. When he fought, it was for the protection of his people, not for personal honors. This single-minded devotion came at a cost. His personal life was marked by loss and loneliness. The woman he loved married another. His daughter died. His wife was chronically ill. He had few close friends, and his aloofness sometimes created distance even with those who admired him. He seemed to have deliberately chosen to keep himself apart, to avoid the entanglements that might distract him from his purpose. There was something almost monk-like in his devotion, a quality of asceticism unusual in Lakota culture, which generally celebrated generosity but also enjoyment of life's pleasures. Crazy Horse seemed to find little pleasure in anything except the execution of his role. He did not participate in the social gatherings and celebrations that others enjoyed. He did not seek the company of others except when necessary. He was, in some fundamental way, alone. Yet this very quality made him effective. His lack of personal ambition meant that others could trust him absolutely. His courage, demonstrated repeatedly in battle, inspired those who followed him. His tactical brilliance in warfare came from his ability to see the battlefield whole, to position himself and his warriors where they could be most effective. He understood terrain, timing, and the capabilities of both his own forces and his enemies. He was not a chief in the political sense. He did not speak in council, did not negotiate treaties, did not manage the complex relationships between bands and with outsiders. Others performed those roles. Crazy Horse was a war leader, a man others followed into battle because they believed in his medicine and his judgment. In an era when warfare became increasingly central to Lakota life, this made him critically important. It is tempting to speculate about what might have happened if Crazy Horse had survived longer, if he had not been killed at Fort Robinson. But such speculation is ultimately pointless. The historical forces arrayed against the Plains Indians were overwhelming. Individual courage and tactical brilliance could delay but not prevent the outcome. The buffalo would still have been destroyed. The military force of the United States would still have been irresistible. The reservation system would still have been imposed. What Crazy Horse did was to embody resistance with honor. He showed that it was possible to fight for what one believed in, to refuse to compromise one's principles, to live and die according to a code that valued something beyond mere survival. In doing so, he became a symbol that transcended his own time and place, the context of his time. To fully appreciate Crazy Horse's life, we must understand the enormous historical transformation he lived through. He was born into a world that had existed for centuries with relatively little change. Yes, the Lakota had acquired horses and guns in the generations before his birth. Yes, they had migrated from the woodlands to the plains. But the fundamental structure of their life, following the buffalo, living in mobile camps, organizing themselves in bands led by chiefs who ruled by consensus rather than command, had been stable for generations. During Crazy Horse's lifetime, this entire world was destroyed. The destruction began slowly, with emigrant trails bringing thousands of settlers through Lakota territory. It accelerated with gold rushes that brought miners into lands guaranteed to the Indians by treaty. It reached its peak after the Civil War, when the full resources of an industrializing nation were brought to bear on the subjugation of the Plains tribes. The transformation was not merely political or military, it was ecological. The buffalo herds that had sustained Plains Indian life for centuries were systematically destroyed. Hide hunters, encouraged by government policy, killed millions of buffalo, sometimes taking only the hides and leaving the meat to rot. Within a few decades, the vast herds that had blackened the prairies were reduced to a few hundred animals. Without the buffalo, the Plains Indian way of life became impossible. It was also biological. Diseases brought by white contact, cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, ravaged native populations that had no immunity. Whole bands were decimated. Traditional medical knowledge was powerless against these new diseases. The death toll was catastrophic, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. It was economic. The introduction of European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth, alcohol, created dependencies that undermined traditional self-sufficiency. The fur trade, and later the hide trade, drew Indians into a market economy that operated according to rules foreign to their culture. The destruction of game animals and the restriction to reservations made traditional hunting and gathering impossible. It was cultural. Missionaries and government officials actively worked to destroy native languages, religious practices, and social structures. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their own customs. The goal was explicit: to kill the Indian and save the man, to eradicate indigenous cultures and force assimilation into white American society. Crazy Horse lived through all of this. He witnessed the beginning of the end of his people's way of life. He fought against it with every means available to him, and he lost. But the manner of his resistance, the integrity with which he lived his life, the courage with which he faced impossible odds, these became part of his legacy, perhaps the most important part. The question of collaboration and resistance. One of the most difficult aspects of this period is the question of how Native leaders should have responded to American expansion. Some, like Red Cloud after 1868, chose to accept the reservation system and work within it, trying to secure the best possible terms for their people. Others, like Crazy Horse, refused to compromise, fighting until forced to surrender. Still others, like Sitting Bull, fled to Canada rather than submit. It would be easy to judge those who chose differently than Crazy Horse, to see them as sellouts or cowards. But such judgments are unfair. Every leader had to make impossible choices, balancing the immediate welfare of their people against long-term considerations, weighing the costs of resistance against the costs of accommodation. Red Cloud, who signed the 1868 treaty and lived out his life on the reservation, was not a coward. He had fought and won a war against the United States, forcing the abandonment of the Bozeman Trail forts. He chose peace when he believed it would serve his people better than continued warfare. He spent decades trying to work within the system to protect Lakota interests, with mixed success. He saw his people survive, even if their way of life was fundamentally changed. Spotted Tail, Crazy Horse's uncle by marriage, made similar choices. He became a pragmatist, dealing with the agents and military officers, trying to secure resources for his people. He was sometimes accused of being too friendly with the whites, but he believed he was doing what was necessary for survival. Crazy Horse represented a different choice: absolute resistance until it became literally impossible to continue. There is a nobility in this stance, a refusal to compromise that appeals to something deep in the human spirit. But it also came at a cost. Those who followed Crazy Horse suffered terribly in the winter of 1876-77. Many died of cold and starvation. When surrender finally came, it was on worse terms than might have been obtained earlier. Who was right? History does not offer clear answers. The Lakota survived as a people, which suggests that the choices of Red Cloud and Spotted Tail had some validity. But they survived with much of their culture destroyed, living in poverty on reservations, which suggests that accommodation had its own terrible costs. Crazy Horse's refusal to surrender until the end preserved his honor and created a legend, but it could not preserve the way of life he was fighting for. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that there were no good choices, only different forms of loss. The forces of American expansion were too powerful, too implacable, driven by too many people seeking land and resources. Individual choices could affect the timing and manner of defeat, but not the ultimate outcome. The personal cost. Throughout this account, we have focused primarily on Crazy Horse as a warrior and historical figure, but it is worth pausing to consider the personal cost of his choices. This was a man who loved and lost, who had a child who died, who was wounded by a jealous rival, who spent his life in constant danger and hardship. His relationship with Black Buffalo Woman was not just a historical footnote, but a source of deep and lasting pain. He loved her, lost her to another man, briefly reclaimed her at enormous cost to his reputation and standing, and then lost her again. The bullet that no water fired into his face left a scar that troubled him for the rest of his life. The daughter born from his brief time with Black Buffalo Woman was raised by another man, a constant reminder of what might have been. His marriage to Black Shawl seems to have been based more on companionship than passionate love. She supported him, managed his household, and bore his daughter. But Black Shawl's chronic illness meant that Crazy Horse had the additional burden of caring for an invalid wife, even as he tried to lead his people through increasingly desperate times. When their daughter died, both parents were devastated, but Crazy Horse's grief was compounded by his inability to prevent the death, his powerlessness in the face of the diseases that white contact had brought. The constant warfare took its own toll. Crazy Horse saw friends and comrades die. He killed men in battle, which, however justified by the circumstances, carries its own psychological weight. He made life and death decisions that affected hundreds of people. He bore responsibility for the welfare of his band, even when circumstances made that welfare almost impossible to secure. The final months of his life, confined to the reservation, must have been particularly difficult. For a man who had spent his entire life in freedom, moving across vast landscapes, making his own decisions, to be confined to a small area and dependent on government rations was a form of torture. To be surrounded by political intrigue, jealousy, and suspicion after a life of straightforward action must have been deeply frustrating. When he was killed at Fort Robinson, it was by men who had once been his friends and allies, on the orders of officers who claimed to be protecting the peace. The betrayal was complete. He died far from the landscapes he had fought for, unable even to die with a weapon in his hand, surrounded by his enemies. For a warrior of his stature, it was an ignoble end, and yet even in death, he maintained his dignity. His last words, as reported by those present, showed no bitterness or despair. He said his plans had been good. He asked to be remembered. He asserted his friendship with the white man, perhaps trying even at the end to promote peace. Then he died quietly, without drama, slipping away into the mystery that had always seemed to surround him. The spiritual dimension. No account of Crazy Horse's life would be complete without addressing the spiritual dimension that was central to his identity. From his vision quest as a young man to his death at Fort Robinson, Crazy Horse lived according to spiritual principles that shaped every aspect of his behavior. The Lakota spiritual worldview that informed Crazy Horse's life was fundamentally different from the Christian framework of the white Americans he fought. For the Lakota, the world was alive with spiritual power. Wakantanka, the Great Mystery, was not a distant creator, but an immanent force present in all things. The stones had spirit, the trees had spirit, the animals, the wind, the thunder, all possessed consciousness and power. Humans could communicate with these spiritual forces through prayer, ceremony, and vision. The vision quest that Crazy Horse undertook as a youth was not a metaphor or a psychological exercise, but a genuine encounter with the spiritual realm. The vision he received was understood as real, a glimpse of his true nature and purpose, a gift from the spirits that would guide and protect him throughout his life. Crazy Horse lived his vision with remarkable literalism. The vision had shown him how to dress for battle, what to wear, how to paint himself and his horse. He followed these instructions precisely. The vision had promised him protection in battle as long as he never took anything for himself, never sought personal glory or gain. He adhered to this restriction throughout his life, giving away war honors and property, remaining poor in material terms even as his reputation grew. This was not superstition or irrational belief. Within the Lakota worldview, it was practical spiritual technology. By living according to his vision, Crazy Horse maintained his relationship with the powers that protected him. His remarkable survival through countless battles, his tactical brilliance, his ability to inspire others, all of these were understood as manifestations of his spiritual power, his medicine. The sacred stone he wore behind his ear, the hawk feather in his hair, the specific patterns painted on his horse, these were not decorations, but spiritual tools, physical anchors for invisible powers. Before battle, Crazy Horse would pray and prepare himself spiritually, entering a state of consciousness in which he was open to spiritual guidance. In battle, witnesses reported, he seemed to know where danger would come from, seemed to move with supernatural speed and prescience. This spiritual dimension also explains some aspects of Crazy Horse's behavior that might otherwise seem strange. His aloofness, his refusal to engage in politics, his indifference to material possessions. All of these can be understood as the behavior of a man who saw himself as an instrument of higher powers, rather than as an autonomous individual seeking his own interests. When the old ways began to fail, when the buffalo disappeared and the military might of the United States proved overwhelming, it must have created a spiritual crisis for Crazy Horse and others like him. If the spirits were all-powerful, why were they allowing the destruction of the Lakota way of life? If the Vision Quest revealed true knowledge, why had it not shown a way to prevent this catastrophe? Some Lakota in this period turned to new spiritual movements, like the ghost dance that would emerge in the late 1880s, which promised the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of the white man through spiritual power. But Crazy Horse did not live to see this movement. He died still living according to his original vision, faithful to the end even as the world that vision had been given in collapsed around him. Crazy Horse and American Memory. In the years after his death, Crazy Horse has been transformed from a historical person into a symbol, claimed and interpreted by various groups for various purposes. This process of mythologization has both illuminated and obscured the man he actually was. For the Lakota and other native peoples, Crazy Horse represents resistance, dignity, and the refusal to compromise fundamental values. His name is invoked in struggles for indigenous rights, for the protection of sacred lands, for the preservation of traditional cultures. The fact that he never signed a treaty, never accommodated himself to white demands, makes him a powerful symbol of indigenous sovereignty. For some non-Native Americans, Crazy Horse represents a kind of romantic ideal, the noble savage, the free spirit, the last defender of a vanishing way of life. This view, while often sincere, can become a form of appropriation, using Crazy Horse's image to represent values that have little to do with who he actually was or what he fought for. The Crazy Horse malt liquor that was marketed using his name and image in the 1990s, despite protests from Native groups, is an egregious example of this kind of appropriation. Military historians study Crazy Horse as a tactical genius, whose methods of warfare anticipated modern concepts of mobile warfare and asymmetric conflict. His ability to coordinate dispersed forces, to use terrain effectively, to create and exploit surprise. All of these have been analyzed and sometimes admired by professional soldiers. Cultural critics see in Crazy Horse's life a critique of materialism and individualism, an example of someone who lived according to communal values and spiritual principles rather than personal gain. His refusal to accumulate possessions, his generosity, his subordination of personal desires to communal needs, these stand in stark contrast to the values of American capitalism. But all of these interpretations risk turning Crazy Horse into a projection screen for contemporary concerns, rather than seeing him as a real person who lived in a specific time and place, facing specific challenges. The historical Crazy Horse was not fighting for abstract principles of resistance or freedom. He was fighting to preserve a specific way of life for a specific people. He was not making a philosophical statement about materialism. He was living according to a vision he received in a specific spiritual tradition. It is important, then, to resist the temptation to make Crazy Horse into whatever we want him to be, and instead try to understand him in his own context. This requires humility, an acknowledgement that some aspects of his experience and worldview are genuinely foreign to us, shaped by a culture and a spiritual framework that we can study but never fully inhabit. At the same time, there are aspects of Crazy Horse's life that do speak across cultures and time. The question of how to respond to overwhelming power without losing one's integrity is universal. The tension between pragmatic accommodation and principled resistance exists in every historical moment. The cost of holding to one's values when the world seems to be moving in a different direction is something many people have faced. In this sense, Crazy Horse's life remains relevant not because he was a superhuman hero, but because he was a human being facing impossible choices and trying to navigate them with honor. He succeeded in some ways, failed in others, and ultimately could not prevent the destruction of the world he fought to preserve. But in the attempt, he created something that has outlasted the circumstances of his life. An example of courage, commitment, and dignity that continues to inspire. The end of our journey. As we come to the end of this long journey through the life of Crazy Horse, it is worth remembering where we began. We started in the world he was born into, the Great Plains in the mid-19th century, a landscape of incredible beauty and abundance, home to vast buffalo herds and mobile bands of people who had learned to thrive in this environment. We traced his development from a quiet, unusual boy to a warrior of extraordinary skill and courage. We followed him through the battles that made him famous, the Fetterman fight, the Rosebud, the Little Bighorn. We witnessed his personal struggles, his love and loss, his wound and recovery. We saw him resist as long as possible, and finally surrender when there was no other choice. We watched him navigate the treacherous waters of reservation life for those final few months, caught between competing interests, misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted, until finally the situation exploded in violence, and he died on the floor of the adjutant's office at Fort Robinson, surrounded by enemies and former friends. Through it all, we have tried to see him as a whole person, not just a warrior or a symbol, but a human being with strengths and weaknesses, with victories and defeats, with moments of great clarity and moments of confusion. We have tried to understand the world that shaped him and the choices available to him. The story of Crazy Horse is ultimately a tragedy. He fought with all his skill and courage to preserve a way of life, and that way of life was destroyed anyway. The buffalo were killed, the land was taken, the people were confined to reservations, the old freedoms were ended. In this sense, his life was a failure, his resistance ultimately futile. But there is another way to measure a life beyond simple success or failure. Crazy Horse lived according to his principles. He did what he believed was right. He protected his people to the best of his ability. He faced death with courage and dignity. He never betrayed his vision or his values, even when doing so might have made his life easier. In a time when many chose accommodation or despair, Crazy Horse chose resistance. In a time when many sought personal advantage, he sought nothing for himself. In a time when many gave up hope, he fought on. These choices did not prevent the historical catastrophe that was unfolding, but they preserved something essential about human dignity and courage. Tonight, as we conclude this story, the landscape that Crazy Horse knew has changed beyond recognition. The buffalo herds are gone, replaced by cattle. The open plains are divided by fences and roads. The bands that once moved freely are settled on reservations. Fort Robinson, where he died, is now a state park and museum. The Black Hills, the heart of everything that is, are dotted with mining operations and tourist attractions. And yet something of Crazy Horse remains. His story is still told. His name is still spoken with respect. Children learn about him in schools. Scholars study his tactics. Native activists invoke his example. A mountain is being carved in his image, his arm pointing to the horizon, to the lands where his dead lie buried. Perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the measure of a life is not whether it succeeds in preserving what cannot be preserved, but whether it creates something, a story, an example, an inspiration, that continues after the individual is gone. In this sense, Crazy Horse succeeded beyond measure. He created a legacy that has outlasted the world that created him. As we close tonight, take a moment to imagine the landscape of the Great Plains under a vast sky, where once the buffalo thundered and the people lived free. Imagine a rider on a swift horse, his hair loose, a hawk feather tied in it, a small stone behind his ear, moving across the grassland with grace and purpose. Imagine a battle, chaos and noise, and in the midst of it, this same rider, calm and focused, protected by powers beyond the visible, fighting for his people, for a way of life, for a vision of how the world should be. That image, that vision, is the gift that Crazy Horse left to all of us. Not a guarantee of victory or a promise that resistance will succeed, but an example of how to live with honor, how to fight for what matters, how to face impossible odds without losing one's humanity. In a world that often seems determined to reduce us to mere consumers or statistics, or passive victims of forces beyond our control, Crazy Horse reminds us that individual courage and commitment still matter, that how we choose to live our lives creates meaning beyond immediate results. Sleep well tonight, and carry with you the memory of a warrior who never surrendered his spirit, even when he was forced to surrender his freedom. Carry with you the image of a man who lived according to his vision, who gave everything for his people, who showed us what it means to live and die with honor. This has been the story of Crazy Horse. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May his memory continue to inspire us, and may his spirit rest in peace in the land he loved and fought to defend. Good night.